Today's episode involves a suicide. If you or someone you love is struggling with suicidal thoughts, please contact the National Suicide Prevention Line at 1-800-273-8255, or you can text the crisis text line by sending the word HOME, that's HOME, to 741-741. When investigating a death, one of the most important pieces of information an investigator can recover is the identity of the victim. There are countless cases of homicides in which the victim's identity has never been discovered, be that due to the efforts of the killer or perhaps the passage of time. What then does an investigator do when the victim's identity is concealed not because of a killer, but by their own choice? In the cold morning hours of December 18, 1996, an unidentified woman strode into Pleasant Valley Memorial Park in Annandale, Virginia. Here, she produced multiple items with which she would set the scene of her death. Among these items was a small Christmas tree from which she hung gold balls and red ribbons. The tree was still standing some hours later when cemetery staff found her lifeless body. For more than 20 years, residents of Annandale, investigators and junior sleuths alike, have worked to try and discover the meaning behind Jane Doe's actions and her true identity. While many clues have been discovered, few connections have been made, but that leads to one ultimate question. If someone elects to leave their life on their own terms and wishes to remain anonymous, should we seek the solution to their mystery? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 95, Annandale Cemetery, Jane Doe. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine a mysterious case that's haunted me personally for many years, though it wasn't until I began the research on this episode until I discovered perhaps the reason why it haunts me. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePodcast, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, social media links, merchandise, and more. As a final note, Trace Evidence is a complete one-man operation. So if you'd like to help support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can gain rewards such as stickers, pins, and other surprises. If Patreon isn't your thing, but you still want to pitch in, there is a PayPal donation button on the website. For the Halloween episode of Trace Evidence, I chose a case that is so unlike so many others that I typically cover on the show. It's a case that truly gets down to the core of what a mystery is, and ultimately asks the question whether or not some mysteries should ever be solved. This is episode 95, Annandale Cemetery, Jane Doe. December 18th, 1996 began as a cool and breezy morning in Annandale, Virginia. While snow hadn't yet begun to blanket the area, residents could feel the nights growing colder and the wind was howling a little louder. The town was adorned with decorations for the coming holiday season. Red bows and green wreaths dotted light poles and storefronts. Christmas lights blinked through the early evenings before going dark as homeowners clicked off the power and went to sleep. In the morning, as some locals were preparing for the day ahead, making their ways to work or school, others remained in their beds, wrapped up in the warmth of their blankets and the comfort of their own homes. However, there was at least one person who would not awaken and would instead pass away sometime between the transition from the darkness of night to the pale pink breaking light of morning. She was found that morning, and yet 23 years later, her name and her life remain complete mysteries. Pleasant Valley Memorial Park is located to the west of Annandale proper at 8420 Little River Turnpike. Spanning 13 acres, the cemetery was opened in 1963 when the estate of George Simmons was sold to a group of developers looking to create a cemetery which, according to its website, was designed for people of all backgrounds, traditions, and faiths. Typically, deaths lead to cemeteries, and whether solved or unsolved, stone markers bear the names of those who have been lost due to age, circumstance, their own hand, or that of another. Many stones stand etched with the names of those whose final moments have never been fully understood, nor the method of their loss completely defined. Many unknown stories end in cemeteries, but on that brisk December morning, Pleasant Valley Memorial Park would become the start of a mystery which has endured and never been solved. Detectives Mike Headley and Richard Perez were given an assignment that December morning at approximately 9 a.m., which would have them heading over to the cemetery to investigate a bizarre scene discovered by employees. They'd arrive less than an hour after receiving the assignment. In a newer section of the memorial park, one specifically designed to house the graves of children, the body of an adult female was discovered. When the detectives arrived on the scene, they were somewhat struck by what they were looking at. An unidentified white female lay on her back on top of a clear plastic sheet, which had been laid out like a picnic blanket. The woman was clearly deceased, but to the surprise of investigators, her skin was still warm to the touch, suggesting that the time of her death hadn't occurred more than a few hours earlier. Not far from where she lay, detectives saw a small, 8-inch tall Christmas tree, which had apparently been erected by the unknown woman. The tree was green and, according to the Doe Network, had been decorated with gold balls and red ribbon. Lying nearby was a portable cassette player, the headphones of which were on the victim's ears, and inside of the player was a cassette of the famous 2,000-year-old man routine as performed by Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. In hopes of finding some further information that might give them a clue as to the victim's identity, the detectives picked up a green backpack that was lying near the victim and searched through it. The contents did little to shine a light on the mystery, as inside all they found were 2 empty juice bottles, peach and mango flavored, a roll of masking tape and 2 additional cassettes, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and Jeff Foxworthy's You Might Be a Redneck. Considering the grim situation lying before them, the presence of so much comedy was ironic, to say the least. As an interesting note, one of the juice bottles found, the peach-flavored one, was branded by the company Loja, and I apologize because I'm probably mispronouncing that. Loja is a Belgium-based drink manufacturer that began operation in 1947. 2 years after Jane Doe's death, Loja was incorporated into the PepsiCo brand, but prior to that, it didn't appear they had produced much of a footprint in North America, or at least the United States. For many, this may be an indicator that Jane Doe could have been from outside of the United States, which could go a distance to explain the lack of an identification thus far. However, judging from the clothing she wore and how well kept she appeared, some have argued the possibility that she may have been a traveler or someone who frequented Europe and acquired a taste for the drink, purchasing it directly. The other beverage bottle found in the backpack was Mystic Brand's Mango Mania. Contrary to the peach drink, this one could more easily be found in the United States. In fact, Mystic's corporate address kicks back to White Plains, New York, located in Westchester County, approximately 25 miles north of Manhattan. There is likely little about this particular bottle that is unique. A 1995 newspaper article reported that the Triarch companies, the owners of Arby's and Royal Crown Soda, had signed a letter of intent to purchase Mystic, which would certainly have seen its availability grow nationally. Currently, Mystic Brands is listed as being owned by the Dr. Pepper Snapple Beverage Group. The woman herself appeared well kept and didn't look to the detectives as though she was just a drifter. The victim, who would eventually be called Jane Doe, was dressed in expensive clothing. A teal-colored, all-weather style Eddie Bauer hooded jacket, size medium. Beneath that, a Classiques and Chair brand sweater, size large in navy blue. For the record, Classiques and Chair is a brand sold at Nordstrom. Then there was a red sweater of the same brand, extra large in size, and both sweaters were over the top of a red, sleeveless silk shirt of, again, the same brand. On her lower body, Jane Doe wore blue knit wool pants over knee-high stockings. She also wore a pair of black loafers, size 7 medium, a white bra for which there was no brand tag, and a white pair of Fruit of the Loom underwear. The NamUs entry states that her clothing may have come from an upscale store such as Saks Fifth Avenue, though I'm unsure if this is due to further information being discovered by investigators or if it was simply a guess and generalization. A quick search for a silk, sleeveless top like the one worn by Jane Doe today pops up on Nordstrom's website with a base price of $268. In terms of jewelry, Jane Doe wore 2 clip-on earrings, a Guess brand watch with a mesh band, a 14-karat gold ring with 4 jade stones set in it, and a single medical alert bracelet which was branded with the following notation: no code, DNR, no penicillin. No code DNR alerts medical workers that should this particular person be found with no heartbeat or not breathing, they are not to try and resuscitate the victim. Bifocals were also found, though I've not found anything to specify if Jane Doe was wearing them at the time or if they were among her personal effects. While the scene itself was strange and certainly mysterious, there was one detail which investigators believed was quite clear. Jane Doe had likely taken her own life. A plastic bag was found over her head, and the masking tape from her backpack had apparently been used to try and seal the bag around her neck to ensure suffocation. In Jane Doe's pockets, detectives found 2 envelopes, each containing a single $50 bill and the same note reading, quote, "Deceased by own hand, prefer no autopsy. Please order cremation with funds provided. Thank you, Jane Doe." One envelope had been addressed to the coroner, while the other had been addressed to the cemetery itself. Whether or not this $100 was all Jane Doe had access to remains unknown. However, in 1996, the price for a cremation was not quite that cheap. Today, the average cost for cremation ranges between $2,000 and $4,000. Later testing would show that, at the time of her death, Jane Doe had a blood alcohol content of 0.14, with 0.08 being the legal limit, meaning that Jane was nearly twice that limit at the time of her death. In addition to alcohol, apparently brandy based on the recovery of a white plastic bottle with a screw-top cap, sometimes described as a flask, Jane Doe had also consumed Valium in what has since been ruled to have been a suicide. Further searching of the victim's pockets and personal effects failed to provide any further clues. However, a poem was located at the scene and reads as follows, quote, "Now I lay me down to sleep, soon to drift to the eternal deep. And though I die and shall not wake, sleep sweeter will be than this life I forsake." End quote. Despite exhaustive efforts by both police and civilians alike, no appearance of this poem has ever been located, which simply seems to imply that the victim wrote it herself. The poem had been typed on a typewriter and not written by hand. You may be wondering if the notes that were in the envelopes were also typed, but I can't answer that for you as I can't find that information. And while an image of the poem exists, there is no public image of the notes that were in the envelopes. Jane Doe was ultimately described as being a white female between the ages of 50 and 70 years old, standing 5 feet tall and weighing approximately 157 pounds. Her hair was closely cropped and described as curly, with it being auburn or red in color, though NamUs does specify at the time her hair color was close to copper. Her fingernails were also painted red and did not appear to be heavily flaked or scratched. Beyond that, Jane Doe had an 8-inch scar running along the midline of her abdomen, believed at first to have been the result of a C-section, suggesting the possibility that she had been a mother at one time or perhaps still was. That final detail adds a sense of curiosity since, as I stated previously, the location she allegedly selected to take her own life was the section of the cemetery specifically set for the burial of children. However, there is some debate about Jane Doe's scar, as some in the medical field have stated that while it could be a C-section scar, it could also suggest the possibility that at some time the victim had an operation related to her intestines, as the scar does curve around the navel. I should note, however, The location of her remains has been specified as being amongst the graves of children, but not close to any particular headstone, and no link has ever been discovered between the children buried in that area and Jane Doe, though most of the headstones in the area were new when she lost her life. Perhaps the location in which her remains were found suggests why people want to lean towards that being a C-section scar, but there might also be another reason. One item I've seen present in the photos of Jane Doe's personal effects is a small, bright pink pouch, sort of like what I grew up knowing as a fanny pack, a small bag which is worn around the waist. This particular one has an image of Minnie Mouse on it, with hearts along the strap. It looks like something that could belong to a child, perhaps another clue to suggest the possibility of motherhood. What I find most fascinating about the pack is its condition. One end of the strap appears to have been damaged and has what looks like masking tape encircling it to secure it, and there's a safety pin sticking out from under it. The zipper has a safety pin through it, perhaps to help apply additional pressure to make a stubborn zipper open more easily. The bag appears to have been worn, making many wonder what was so important and significant about this particular pack that Jane Doe not only went through the trouble to keep it and take care of it, but to also bring it to the site of her death. It was highly believed at the time that Jane Doe had come into the cemetery sometime during the night, laid the plastic sheet down, set the Christmas tree in place, and either began or continued drinking brandy, chased the Valium with it, put on her headphones, began playing the comedy tape, and then placed the bag over her head, used the tape to try and secure it, all before lying down and drifting off into unconsciousness and eventually death. What events culminated in her life that led her down this path remain unknown, as does her identity. A search of missing persons reports from the area failed to return anyone detectives felt matched the victim, and when her information was sent out nationwide, again, no missing person was ever confirmed. In fact, according to NamUs, as of today, Jane Doe has been excluded as being 619 missing people via comparison. Identification proved more challenging than investigators had initially imagined. Typically, they struggle to ID victims when little can be found or partial remains are recovered, but in this instance, they had a victim who, for lack of a better term, was fresh and not mutilated or subject to extensive decomposition. Detective Perez spoke with the Washington Post, and during that interview stated, quote, "What makes it so frustrating is this isn't a case where we're dealing with skeletal remains. This is a lady that somebody should recognize." End quote. Fingerprints were taken at the time and submitted to multiple services as well as the FBI, but no matches have ever been made. According to the Doe Network entry for Jane Doe, DNA is listed as samples submitted, tests not complete. Detectives did work on Jane Doe's case, but found themselves essentially searching in the dark without a light. They had nothing much to work off of once there was no missing persons established. The problem is, it's been over 20 years since Jane Doe took her life in that cemetery, and her identity still hasn't been discovered. There could be a number of reasons why. Maybe her fingerprints aren't on file anywhere, which isn't all that difficult to imagine. Maybe there was no missing persons report because there was no one left to report her missing. Many have entertained the possibility that Jane Doe may have been without family and may have been diagnosed with some kind of a terminal illness, and instead chose to go out on her own terms. The theories surrounding this incredibly mysterious situation are almost endless, and almost every forum has multiple threads discussing Jane Doe and her possible motives and origin. So the question at the heart of this case for many is, who was Jane Doe? For some, beyond that knowledge, they also have a desire to know the reason she chose to end her life the way she did. We've seen things like this before, though. The Lyle Stivic case, for instance, in which an unknown man used an alias to check into a motel, taking his life shortly thereafter. This was a mystery that haunted many for years until it was recently solved. The true identity of Lyle Stivic has never been released, as his family elected to keep his identity private to stay in line with his apparent wishes. While that case is somewhat different, there is another case that bears a striking resemblance to Jane Doe's. On October 9th, 1996, 2 months before Jane Doe's suicide, nearly 3,000 miles to the west in Seattle, Washington, A woman calling herself Mary Anderson checked into the Hotel Vintage Park. When filling out forms for the room, Mary Anderson wrote her address as 123 East 3rd Street, New York, and scribed her phone number as 212-569-5549. Later, it would be discovered that her phone number was fake and the address she gave did not exist. Neither, in fact, did Mary Anderson. However, none of this would be discovered until 2 days after she had checked in. On October 11th, employees at the hotel grew concerned when none had seen Mary, and when checkout time passed, they allowed themselves into her room to check on her. In the room, hotel staff found Mary Anderson deceased, lying in bed. Her short, auburn, copper-colored hair was neatly styled. Her fingernails were freshly painted a shade of white. She was dressed in all black: leggings, black top, black leather slippers. She had applied makeup, including a pinkish shade of lipstick. Found in proximity to the body were some personal effects, including 6 velour outfits, black leather gloves, and a set of pantyhose. Other items recovered in the room included a green leather purse, 2 suitcases, Estee Lauder brand cosmetics, perfume, toothpaste, Metamucil, Crystal Light, an iron, and a bowl. Mary Anderson, as she called herself, was described as being a white female between the ages of 30 and 50, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing 240 pounds. Her eyes were brown. Examination would find that Mary had scars on her chest, surgical, suggesting the possibility of a breast reduction in the past. She also had a copper IUD, or intrauterine device, implanted in her. Investigation into Mary Anderson's death would go much like the investigation into Jane Doe's. In this instance, Mary took more extreme measures to ensure her passage out of this life. Her last drink, it seems, was a cocktail comprised of Metamucil and cyanide. Lying on the table beside the bed was a note, apparently written by Mary's hand, which read as follows, quote, "To whom it may concern, I have decided to end my life and no one is responsible for my death. Mary Anderson. P.S. I have no relatives. You can use my body as you choose." End quote. In addition to her personal effects and note, when Mary was found, a black leather-bound Bible was lying on her chest. The Bible was open to Psalms, specifically Psalm 23, which is commonly read at Christian funerals, and for those who are unfamiliar, reads as follows, quote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." End quote. Considering the manner in which she was dressed and the Bible open to that particular psalm, it seems almost as if Mary Anderson had herself her own private funeral. Photographs were taken of Mary Anderson at the time she was found and are available for viewing. While photographs of deceased individuals are not always the nicest things to see in the world of true crime, at least in Mary's case, she does seem to be at peace. Beyond those photographs, artist renditions were created to circulate in hopes of receiving an identification. But much like the case of Jane Doe, there's never been an identification made. While Jane Doe has received over 600 exclusions through comparison, NamUs lists only 2 who have been excluded when tested against Mary Anderson, though both of these people have not led to an identification. 2 women, 2 months and thousands of miles apart, apparently took their own lives and went out on their own terms. Both women went to lengths to conceal their true identities and left behind a slew of clues which have never been able to lead to the truth of who they were or why they made the choice that they did. Could Mary Anderson have inspired Jane Doe? Her story was likely in papers in the months leading up to Jane Doe's death. Or were these 2 individuals working off their own plans that simply happened to take their lives just 70 days apart in similar ways? Then, of course, there's the physical resemblance. I'll post photos up on the website if you'd like to see them, but for the most part, many, including myself, agree that Jane Doe and Mary Anderson bear a striking resemblance, from the color of their hair to the shapes of their faces. Yet more similarities and coincidences that truly add to the mystery and haunting nature of both cases. These are all questions for which many seek the answers, but the passage of time certainly seems to dim the possibility of ever knowing it all. In the Lyle Stivic case, DNA was used for genetic relative comparison, and it was the DNA Doe Project, in conjunction with Aerodyne and the Full Genomes Corporation, who ultimately unraveled the mystery. Perhaps someday the same will be done for Jane Doe and Mary Anderson. Investigating these cases, however, has led me to something that may in fact be the antithesis of my desire to explore unsolved cases. Maybe it's better for them to remain unknown if that's what they truly desired. In the Stivic case, his identity was kept secret by the family, and perhaps if Jane Doe or Mary Anderson are ever identified, the same will happen, but there's certainly something haunting about studying and researching people who never wanted you to know who they truly are. It seems counterintuitive to a degree to not want to discover the truth, but perhaps that's the best answer one can provide in this situation. But of course, what would trace evidence be without spending some time on the theories? One theory suggests the possibility that Jane Doe's death may not have been a suicide, but rather an elaborate murder made to look like one. There are those who believe that Jane Doe's situation, the circumstances of her discovery, and the notes left behind ensured that a homicide investigation wouldn't take place. Another theory argues that Jane may have taken her own life due to some kind of a terminal illness or unfortunate situation, perhaps the death of a loved one, that resulted in her ultimately making the choice to end her own suffering. One final theory is that Jane Doe lived a life that we will never understand. She experienced things we may never know, and made a choice to take her own life because that's how she wished to do it. Lying in a cemetery, listening to things that made her laugh, and saying a silent goodbye. In the cold morning hours of December 18th, Jane Doe walked into Pleasant Valley Memorial Park and turned toward the children's area. Once arriving, she laid out a plastic sheet, placed her bag down, and began drinking and taking Valium. She set up a small Christmas tree, decorated with gold balls and red ribbons, sitting it just to the side of the plastic sheet. After an unknown amount of time, the moment occurred, and she popped the comedy cassette into her player, pulled on her headphones, placed a plastic bag over her own head, and attempted to secure it with masking tape. Placing the tape back in her bag, Jane laid down on the plastic and closed her eyes. The final sounds she heard were those of a comedy team. Her final sight would likely have been the starry night sky, as viewed through a plastic bag that was slowly fogging up. Perhaps we'll never know the true identity of Jane Doe, and maybe there's no one out there looking for her. But while her name may have been lost to time, perhaps irretrievably, the mystery of her death and the questions about her life will always echo. But no question more profound than whether or not Jane Doe found the peace she so desperately sought. Except perhaps whether or not it is to honor her to find her name, or to let it be lost to time as she apparently desired. Maybe this isn't the type of episode you'd imagine I'd target for Halloween, but everyone's scared of different things. I've thought about this particular case ever since I first learned about it years ago, and I could never put my finger on exactly what it was that bothered me so much. Obviously, I spend a lot of my time looking at unsolved cases, and so you'd think it'd be natural that this would stick with me because of how mysterious it is. But the more I researched and the more I wrote, the more I realized it was the opposite. I think I'm haunted by this case in part because it's a mystery that Jane Doe didn't want to be solved. Now, we don't know the reasons why, and there are certainly plenty of people digging to find the answers, but you have to ask yourself eventually if you're looking for the answers for Jane or if you're looking for the answers for you. I have no issue with anyone trying to solve this mystery. Mysteries bring us together, They cause us to pool our efforts and to work together to try and find a solution. It just feels strange working on one that, for lack of a better term, the victim wanted to remain a mystery. So why did I cover this case if that's my perspective? Well, I didn't know that was my perspective until I started writing, and while I'd love to claim that I have zero interest in finding the answers, I'm fully aware of the driving force inside of me that has an incessant need for answers. It's the main reason I started this show in the first place. I thought also it was exciting to try and tackle a case from a different angle than I usually do, and this case is absolutely different. Who was Jane Doe? At some point in time, Jane Doe had a mother. Whether or not this mother raised her, gave her up for adoption, or some other possibility, there were people in Jane's life that she interacted with. She may have had a job, met people while traveling, dated, loved, and lost. She may have even had a child, though that's up for debate. The point is, she was someone at some point in time. So what leads a person to want to not only die, but to eliminate the entirety of who they were in the process? There are some who believe that Jane Doe did not make that choice, and that instead someone else made the choice for her and staged the entire scene. So that's going to move us into the first theory, that Jane Doe was the victim of a murder. There's not a lot of meat on this bone, and I'm addressing it predominantly because I commonly see it discussed on forums where Jane Doe's case is being talked about. I can understand it. I have a suspicious mind myself, and frankly, if you wanted to commit a murder and get away with it, you couldn't do much better than what happened here. The combination of the notes and the way the scene was set certainly points towards suicide, but there are many who simply ask, what if that's not what happened? Once you really begin to look at the murder possibility in this case, you'll find you don't have much to work with. No fingerprints, forensics, or any kind of evidence to show that Jane Doe's death occurred due to anything other than her own decision. Not to mention, the way everything was arranged, it seems pretty unlikely that a killer would have gone through all that just to stage a suicide. The notes alone probably would have been enough to do that. I don't think the Christmas tree and poem were necessary, but as we know, killers' minds don't work like ours do, and we've seen them do some pretty crazy things in other cases, so, alright, let's entertain the possibility. If Jane Doe was murdered, then the killer had to have planned this crime out and executed it perfectly. Whether that involved putting Valium in Jane Doe's brandy and then applying the plastic bag once she started to drift into unconsciousness, or if that happened elsewhere and Jane was brought to the cemetery and staged as she was found, I don't know. It's possible, though it doesn't seem very likely. If you wanted to kill someone, there are much quicker and more efficient ways to commit that crime. We know that, as far as research has shown, no missing persons case perfectly matched up with Jane's, and so there's a good likelihood that no one would have been looking for her. If she'd never been found in that cemetery, would anyone have known she was gone in the first place? Perhaps a killer wouldn't have been privy to that information, or maybe the one person who could have filed that missing persons report was her killer. It seems highly unlikely that Jane Doe went through her whole life without ever forming a friendship or attachment to anyone. No matter what way you slice this, someone knew her, whether that's a taxi driver, deli clerk, delivery man, or maybe a family member. There must have been someone out there who would have recognized her had they seen the images that had been presented. Maybe they've never seen them. Maybe they've passed away in the 23 years since, or maybe they consciously chose not to acknowledge her due to some conversation they'd had with her in the past. It's really something we may never understand, and while murder, at least in this instance, might seem to be a little less confusing, this case doesn't really scream murder. At least, not murder in the way that we often describe it. Murder could be a possibility here, but maybe not in the typical way, not in the way that we normally think of it. What if Jane did want to die, for one reason or another, but felt herself incapable of pulling that off? Maybe she would have sought out help. Maybe she'd have found someone in her life who was willing to go the distance to help her do what she lacked the ability to do on her own in some form of assisted suicide. That's not completely out of the realm of possibility, but again, nothing was really found to suggest the presence of another person, nor was there any evidence, as far as we know, collected to show that Jane Doe did not do everything on her own. While the murder theory is interesting, it falls apart pretty quickly once you put it under the microscope. I think for some, it's easier to accept that someone was murdered rather than making the terrible choice to take their own life. But what if she had believed she had a good reason to take her own life? And that leads us into our second theory. There are a lot of people who have made the connection that Jane Doe may have committed suicide in order to get ahead of some kind of terminal illness which would put her through a lot of pain and suffering. The surgical scar on her abdomen, while not clearly defined, could possibly be linked to an operation or surgery related to a life-threatening illness. A lot of people out there, when faced with the possibility of battling a devastating illness, look for an easier way out. And while I am no proponent of suicide, I can't particularly say that I blame them. As we've discussed in the previous theory, assisted suicide is a thing, and there are plenty of people who have utilized it, whether legal or illegal. Just ask Dr. Kevorkian about that. Suicide is typically not a rational choice. There are so many different angles to it, so many different influences, from mental health issues to general health issues, and a lot of times, we don't understand why someone makes that choice. I've said in past episodes, and I believe truly, that if you've never been suicidal, then it's really difficult to wrap your head around it. Your brain is not working normally during those times. Your thought process is not guiding you through all of the possibilities. There's a primary focus, a dark one, and your mind has an amazing way of warping reality to bend to the necessity of that focus. Suddenly, all of the light in the world seems to just turn into darkness. As far as can be ascertained, a full and thorough autopsy was not conducted on Jane Doe, or at least not one which has ever been shown to the public. While Jane Doe's notes requested no autopsy, an act which makes some people believe more in theory number one, Virginia law would have dictated that one take place. According to Virginia Law Code 32.1-283 subset A, an autopsy is required, quote, upon the death of any person from trauma, injury, violence, poisoning, accident, suicide, or homicide, end quote. So whether or not a full and thorough autopsy happened, I can't say with 100% certainty. There does seem to be some information available out there that, given the circumstances, the cause of death was determined, blood work was done, and a viewing was done, but not the full invasive measures of an autopsy itself. If that's the case, then there's no way we could know for sure if Jane Doe was suffering from any kind of terminal or debilitating illness. I wish we had more information to work with in that regard, but in all honesty, there's not a great deal of information about Jane Doe that's publicly available, in part because there's not a lot of information about Jane Doe that's known at all. The fact of the matter is, we can neither rule this in or out. In the poem found at the scene, the final lines read, "Sleep sweeter will be than this life I forsake." Forsake is an interesting word choice, as it doesn't mean something you're forced to do or something you're doing because of something else. Forsake basically means to vacate, abandon, to give up. It's obvious from the poem that there was at least something in Jane Doe's life that she wished to escape from, believing that death would be sweeter than life had been. But what could that have been? Anything. Physical, psychological, emotional. Sadly, we simply don't have the information to know if the thing that pushed her over the edge, or one of those things, was an illness. A lot of people believe it was psychological, trauma, some kind of pain or loss that Jane Doe couldn't overcome. And that leads us into the final theory, that Jane Doe's reason for taking her own life was something innately tied to the very life she chose to abandon and erase. Why the children's section of the cemetery? I know there's debate about the scar on her abdomen, and while I certainly see more similarities between that scar and general surgery versus a C-section, there are several links between Jane and a possible child. She chose the area near deceased children and had in her possession that pink Minnie Mouse pouch that seems like something that would have belonged to a child. She carried her possessions in a backpack, not a shoulder bag or duffel, something an adult is more likely to select, especially one with fashion tastes that lead to high-class stores. Now, sure, it's possible that Jane got those clothes secondhand, or they were donated at some point, and the bag was something she picked up along the way, same as with the Minnie Mouse pouch. But that pouch really stands out against her selection of personal effects. Some people believe that Jane Doe may have experienced the loss of a child, due to death or perhaps something else that divided them, and that this was the main cause for her choice to end her own life. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. The loss of a child, as we've seen in so many cases, is not something that a parent ever overcomes or forgets. Some find ways to utilize it, to build something more, to work harder, and others are pulled down into the pain and sorrow of that grief. Jane certainly could have lost a child somewhere, somehow, and found herself drowning in that pain. Suicide is never a good option. It's never the best choice to make because when you make that choice, you eliminate the possibility of ever making any other choices. What if things change tomorrow? Well, maybe Jane knew they never would, and if her child was deceased, if she had had one, that certainly carries a finality to it. Maybe the answer as to Jane's reason has less to do with all the endless questions we can ask about her life and more to do with the location. Why Annandale and why Pleasant Valley Memorial Park? While this is certainly a cemetery in the area that locals would be aware of, would someone new to town be familiar with it? Police didn't think that Jane was a drifter, but no one in the area recognized her, which is intensely frustrating. Could she have truly lived such an anonymous life for a period of time that no one ever knew she was there? It seems improbable, but there are people out there right now that no one knows, that no one would recognize if they went missing tomorrow. I know for a while, a lot of people were believing there was a good chance Jane Doe was not originally from the United States, or maybe had spent a lot of time overseas. The Belgium drink was basically a factor related to the structure of that theory. Another detail that I read on a forum for Porchlight International for the Missing and Unidentified discussed Jane's glasses, and that a series of letters inscribed by the manufacturer tracked back to Belgium. Frankly, I don't know if she was from Belgium or simply visited there, and I don't know that there's any major way to determine that short of solving the mystery of who Jane Doe was to begin with, but it is important to note that Annandale isn't that far from Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. certainly houses an international airport. If indeed she was from somewhere else, or lived somewhere else for a long enough time, that adds an extra level of curiosity to the question of why she chose this particular cemetery. Oftentimes, when someone makes the choice to take their own life, they choose a location they're comfortable with or that holds some kind of a special meaning to them. Is it possible that this cemetery holds some kind of clue as to Jane's identity, or is it as seemingly random as everything else that happened the night she died? A lot of civilian investigators and police themselves have gone through that cemetery trying to find a link, but nothing solid's ever been discovered. One interesting question is, how did Jane Doe come to be in this cemetery in the first place? No vehicle was located, whether of a car or a bike. As far as we're aware, no taxi drivers reported dropping anyone off at the cemetery at any time of the day or night, and that's probably something you'd remember. There is, however, public transportation that could have been used, and Jane certainly could have been dropped off and then walked to the cemetery, but again, that would mean she was familiar with its location and selected it in advance for reasons we can't begin to fathom. Authorities have said they thought the cemetery was chosen not based on any major connections, but more so she knew no one would be there at night, and it was far enough away from the main road that it was unlikely someone would be walking by while she was ending her life. Then there's the timing. Why did she do this a week before Christmas on December 18th? Was there something significant about that particular date? She had a Christmas tree, so why not wait until the 25th? Unfortunately, those are just more questions added into the stack of questions about this case that we may never have answers to. This is an extremely sad case that is essentially just that series of unanswered questions, and maybe the way Jane Doe wanted it to be. Whatever the case, whatever the reason, Jane went to extreme lengths to ensure that her identity would not be discovered. There's a loneliness about it all, isn't there? Imagining this woman in the cold, lying on plastic on the ground beside a little Christmas tree, allowing her life to drift away as she faded from consciousness. Maybe, if Jane Doe had known how many people would be trying to determine who she was, she may have felt less compelled to do what she did. Maybe that loneliness was a leading factor, but that's just speculation, like almost everything in this case. The fact is, this is a case where we may never have an answer, and in what I'm sure will be an extremely rare occurrence on this show, I will say that that wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world, if that's what Jane truly wanted. If you're looking for more information about the death of Jane Doe, there are many websites, forums, and blogs covering her case. There's a lot of people there with a lot of theories that have worked very hard to try and unravel this mystery if you truly want to find the answer to it. Jane Doe's profile can be found on NCIC under case number U989549567 and on NamUs under UP6279. If you have any information about the death of Jane Doe, please contact the Fairfax County Police Department at 703-691-2131 or the Northern District Medical Examiner's Office at 703-530-2600. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, Instagram message me at TraceEvidencePod, or comment in the Facebook group. It's time for a shout out to our amazing Patreon producers. I have to start off this month's list of Patreon producers with Tara Doble, who I accidentally removed from this list for reasons I have yet to comprehend. So I'm deeply sorry for that, Tara, and I very much appreciate your contributions. Now, moving on to the rest of the Patreon producers. Angie Dodd, Emily Smith, Megan Cotter, Kate Alexander, Chandra Moreau, Robbie Blue, Brian Kemmerling, Wannabe Sleuth 2, Laura Dickinson, Julia Rexon, Diane Dyson, Tom Archer, Eamon Brady, Nick Mohar Schurz, Alicia Lorraine, Jessica, Krista Colvin, Randy Weiland, Brittany Bivens, Glenda Piper, and Megan. You're all amazing, and if you're new and I mispronounced your name, just shoot me a message and I'll correct it. I know this episode was a little out of the ordinary for me, but I did want to do something different for Halloween, and this case has always been something that's close to my heart, so I truly appreciate you listening, and I hope that you have a very happy and safe Halloween this coming week should you celebrate it. As the holidays approach and the world gets a little crazy, I wanted to give you a quick schedule update. I'm going to be taking a week off in November because I'll be traveling to see family, but that should be the only week off I take until December 9th, when I release episode 100. Following that episode, I'll take my usual December hiatus. When I return from my holiday break in January of 2020, Trace Evidence will move its release date from Monday to Tuesday. This is going to make my life a lot easier, and I'm hoping the transition will be smooth for you. And as one last final note, for Patreon supporters, this month's exclusive episode will release on October 30th, just in time for Halloween. So thank you again so much for listening to this episode, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.